Suzanne has been a member of the Native Plant Society of Texas since 1992, and she was elected a Fellow of the Society in 2007. She currently serves on its Native Landscape Certification Program Steering Committee. Suzanne has taught training classes for various chapters of the Texas Master Naturalist Program since 1999. She also serves on the boards of directors for the Fort Worth chapter of the Native Prairies Association of Texas and the John Bunker Sands Wetland Center of Combine, Texas. On a personal note, Suzanne is one of my favorite people. She is so knowledgeable about the plants and animals of Texas, among other things. And when she was manager at the Nature Center, they hired me on as an education naturalist, and she was the absolutely best mentor anyone could ever ask for. And I'm deeply indebted to her. Thank you. Suzanne's program tonight is titled Uncommon Wildflowers of the Lbj National Grasslands. The Lyndon B. Johnson National Grasslands covers a 20,250 acre patchwork of federally protected land north and west of Decatur, Texas. The area, located at a transition zone between the Fort Worth Prairie to the east and western cross timbers to the west, is home to a rich jewel box of wildflowers. Since her retirement in 2016, program presenter Suzanne Tuttle has spent many hours roaming the hills and ravines of the grasslands, assisting with plant community inventories. This presentation highlights a few of her favorite finds. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Wow, I'm not sure I can go on after that wonderful presentation, but or introduction, but thank you very much. So I do want to give a lot of credit to Mary Curry, who's mentioned on this title slide. She's a wonderful photographer. She has written a book about wildflowers in North Central Texas, and she actually allowed me to use a number of her wildflower photographs for this presentation. So her name is credited on the photos, of course, that she took. Mary's also the leader of our little wildflower wandering group that goes out several times a month. I don't actually get to join as often, maybe once or twice a month, but it's been a wonderful experience. And let me share my screen, or open the presentation so I can start. It'll let me. There we go. Okay. So some people watching may not be familiar with the Lbj Grasslands, especially since we're able to broadcast virtually anywhere now. So I wanted to give just a little bit of background about the grasslands. Of course, it is federally owned, but it's not managed by the U.S. Department of the Interior like so many of the parkland areas that are federally owned are managed. It's actually managed by the Department of Agriculture, and it was established in response to the Dust Bowl catastrophe in the 1930s. And so it was actually put under the U.S. Forest Service, but it seems a little odd to have a grassland under the Forest Service, but that's who's the official manager of Lbj. So it is managed by the Agriculture Department and not the Interior Department. So it's like a park, but it's not exactly like a park. It has some different uses that people are not accustomed to for what people think of as a park. So there's agricultural uses. It's still grazed. They have grazing leases. It's responsibly grazed. They have specific contracts with different livestock owners, and their requirements for rotation and, not overstocking and that sort of thing. But there when you go out there, you're liable to run into a herd of cows roaming around and grazing. So you need to be mentally prepared for that. Of course, there are recreational uses. There's lakes. There's some little picnic areas. There's lots of trails. There's a very big horseback riding community that has pretty much adopted the grasslands. There's a whole campground and a whole trail system that is geared towards horseback riding. And then there are also industrial uses. There are oil and gas leases on the grasslands. So you're liable to run into to find some industrial equipment out there. So the grasslands are found at an ecotone, as it said in the introduction, of Fort Worth Prairie and the Western Cross Timbers, and it's in Wise County. And I've put a big black dot on Wise County on this map, and you can see it falls within the Cross Timbers and Prairies ecoregion, according to the Gould map. And this area looks really homogeneous, like it's all the same ecosystem type, but it's not. It's actually very complex, and it's at least 4 different distinct ecosystems within this one brown blob. So this is a closer up photo or a drawing of the green patches are Western Cross Timbers. This green patch here is the Eastern Cross Timbers. This is the Fort Worth Prairie. And you can see how these areas are very intermingled. Here's Wise County, and the grasslands fall in this area. So there's like I said, an ecotone of where the Fort Worth Prairie and the Western Cross Timbers meet and transition. So it's a very diverse landscape full of a whole different suite of plants that's some like the limestone soil of the prairie, Fort Worth Prairie, some like the sandy soil of the Cross Timbers. I took a photograph. This is my map of the Lbj Grasslands. And this is another thing that might be a little confusing to first-time visitors. It's not a contiguous piece of property. This map shows this is the jurisdictional boundary of the grasslands. And so when it was first set up, the federal government set a boundary in which they would try to acquire property. And the purpose of acquiring the property was to try to mitigate some of the terrible erosion that was going on in the Dust Bowl. And for orientation, here's Highway 287 on its way to Bowie and Wichita Falls. And so the grassland actually, the federal properties exist as a patchwork inside this jurisdictional boundary. So all of this white property is privately owned. And you might, and in fact, I have a very good friend who lives up here, and her property directly abuts the grassland. So right across her fence line is federal property. So it's my understanding that the government is not trying to acquire any more property within this jurisdictional boundary. So what the federal government owns currently, it owns. As far as infrastructure for visits, there's a lot of these units. These are called units. They're not, they don't have any parking areas per se that are specifically dedicated. So sometimes you just have to park on the roadside or park on a little pull-in drive. There's only 2 or 3 spots like at Black Creek Lake and at Tadra and at Clear Lake where there's actually parking areas, and it's more of a formal recreation area. So what does an ecotone look like? What does the greater landscape look like? Well, what happens is that the Western Cross Timbers, that sandy soil, that sandstone formation, it's older than the Fort Worth Prairie, which is limestone. So what you find out there is you find these knobs or areas where the limestone has not all eroded off. And then below the younger limestone are sandy, grassy savanna areas that are, and the sandy soil is more acidic. The hilly limestone areas are very alkaline. And so this is a very typical landscape that you see out there, and there'll be a really different plant community on top of this knob than there is down in this grassy area. So here's part of the Wildflower Hunters crew. And so what I have been doing is Mary Curry, our leader, she's a contractor with the Grasslands staff, and she actually goes out and does phenology updates. She keeps track of what's blooming when. And she's been specifically focused for several years on finding a very uncommon wildflower, which is this narrow leaf morning glory. So this is in, of course, this is in the Convolvulaceae family, if you're interested in the taxonomy. It is a morning glory. It's a wild native morning glory. And if you are familiar with the way morning glory foliage often looks, it looks like a heart-shaped leaf. It's called cordate, where it's wider at the top and then narrows to a point like a heart. Well, the narrow leaf morning glory is got very narrow linear leaves. And when it's not flowering, it's obviously very showy when it's flowering. But when it's not flowering, it's almost impossible to find. And so it's been a wonderful training for me to learn how to spot this morning glory. And of course, Mary and Jean Erickson, who is another one of the longtime wildflower wanderers, they're experts at seeing this foliage even without the flowers. I'm still quite a novice at it, and it takes me a while to get my eye focused and trained on what I'm supposed to be looking for. So this actually brings up a question of what makes a wildflower uncommon. And there's a lot of different possibilities. In the case of narrowleaf morning glory, I think a lot of it is because it requires a very specific soil type. And Mary has mapped the grasslands extensively, and she and her daughter Claire know where all the different soil types are. And so they know where specific areas of focus are that we should be looking for this plant. And so that helps guide our search when we go out wandering.
Narrowleaf morning glory, is it sand or limestone?
Sand, deep sand. So there's specific soil types that it grows on. And so that's where we go and search for it.
Thank you.
Okay. So I tried to group there's only 14 flowers in this presentation, and I slightly changed the title to Some Uncommon Wildflowers because I didn't want to imply that this was the exhaustive list of all the wildflowers that are uncommon out there, because it is not. These are just favorites of mine that we've come across. And so I tried to group them in somewhat related communities. And so this first little set, these are all spring ephemeral bulb flowers. When you find them, they're typically locally very common, but they have specific habitat requirements, and they have a very short flowering season when they're obvious. And so that's another thing that makes them somewhat uncommon, is that if you're not out there at the right time of year, you may not see them for another whole year. Some flowers like prairie verbena, Engelmann daisy, they have very long, and they rebloom, and so you see them for a very long flowering period. But a lot of these flowers only have a very specific narrow window when they flower, and so you just have to be out there at the right time. So this has been the subject of one of our recent searches. This is white trout lily, or Midland fawn lily. This one is more related. This is more one of the Great Plains northern. We also have another species like is found at Tandy Hills in Fort Worth, the Erythronium albinum, the white trout lily, but this is a little bit different species. It's more northerly. And it's really a wildflower of woodlands, but this time of year, the trees are not leafed out. So there's a lot of dappled sun on the forest floor. And so these leaves get plenty of sun to photosynthesize so they can charge up enough energy to bring them to the next year. Trout lilies are called trout lilies because they have mottled leaves that looks like the speckling on a trout. They're also called fawn lilies for the same reason, because deer fawns are speckled. They only plants that have 2 leaves will produce a flower. If they only have 1 leaf, they're either immature or they might be a sterile vegetative reproductive form that reproduces with rhizomes and puts out little bulblets at the ends of rhizomes. They're hard to see. You can see how camouflaged they are, and they typically don't have their face up like this. They typically nod over, so that makes them even a little harder to see because you don't have that bright yellow eye to catch your attention. Oh, and let me say one last thing. Let me say one last thing about trout lily. Trout lily, if you're interested in taxonomy, there's been a lot of taxonomic reshuffling lately because there's so much work being done with DNA analysis. And so the lily family, which is pretty large, has gotten split. And a lot of things that were in the lily family have now been reclassified into the asparagus family. And trout lily is one that actually has stayed in the lily family, but blue funnel lily has actually gotten moved to the asparagus family. This flowers this time of year, very ephemeral. It only flowers for a couple or 3 weeks. And you can see by the foliage that it would be very difficult to find. See, here's a picture of it in a grassy area. This is where it likes to grow, is on limestone gravel. This just happened to be a grassy area that had a little bit more cover, but you can see how difficult it would be to find the rosette in grass before the flowers come up. And even when the flowers come up, they're this wonderful pale blue, and the back sides of them, and look at all the different modeling and different shading. They're really hard to spot. I don't know about a lot of people, but I don't have as much, I'm not as good at spotting things that are shaded in the blue color range as I do like yellow or white or even red. And so these are hard for me to spot, and I have to really look and focus to try to find them when they should be flowering. These are really interesting. If y'all have ever seen a book, it's called Edible Wild Plants of the Prairie by Dr. Kelly Kinsher. He worked for the Kansas Biological Service for many years, and he's written a couple of wonderful books about the prairie called Medicinal Wild Plants of the Prairie and Edible Wild Plants of the Prairie. And blue funnel lily is in that book as an edible plant, and apparently the corms are tasty if they're roasted, which I would never do because I couldn't bear to dig up something this beautiful. But it's really, really interesting that he talked about the structure, and the corm of these flowers has 2 parts to it. It's like a figure 8. And the upper part is where the flower, of course, comes from. And then after it flowers, that upper corm shrivels and the lower corm becomes the upper corm, and a new corm develops. The storage corm develops at the bottom. So I found that really fascinating, and there is no way you can age these. They could be hundreds of years old if, the same plant could have just been renewing that corm over and over again. I just find that really fascinating. And really find it fascinating and gives me that much more incentive to try to conserve plants like this, because they're so, people don't know about them. They're so ephemeral. They only last for a few weeks, and so they're waiting there underground. But I'm sorry, I forgot to say that blue funnel. Yeah, I think I did say blue funnel lily has been reclassified into the asparagus family, and so has wild hyacinth has been reclassified into the asparagus family. This is a little more showy because it gets tall. And these typically or oftentimes will grow in pretty nice colonies. So you can spot these, and they have a little bit longer flowering season because they have this spike, which is called an indeterminate spike. What that means is that the flowers start opening, but the spike keeps elongating. So when a flower is, or a plant is determinate, that means it grows to a certain height or the flower grows to a certain length, and then it starts opening from the top going down. In an indeterminate spike, they start opening at the bottom before the whole spike has even elongated. So these have a little bit longer flowering season, but again, they have foliage. The rosette looks like long grass blades, so it's pretty hard to spot them. And also the fact that they're a violet color makes it a little more difficult to spot.
Suzanne, could you tell us the name again of those two Prairie books that you mentioned?
Hang on. I have them right here. Edible Wild Plants of the Prairie by Kelly Kincher. I don't know if you can see that okay.
Good.
And Medicinal Wild Plants of the Prairie by the same author.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is a very, very interesting plant. This actually has been reclassified into the Orobanchiaceae, which is the parasitic plant family. This is American Blue Hearts. I have never seen this anywhere else, but not even actually at the Grasslands, but a private prairie that's owned up in that same general area. But these actually are parasitic on, I'm not sure what the host plant is actually. I'm sorry, I should have looked that up, or if they even know what the host plant is. But these seem to grow in kind of seepy areas, sort of like the same kind of area where bluebells would grow, where on a hillside where it's a little bit of water that seeps out of the hill. Really a fascinating plant, and it's always very exciting to see it. I don't know much else about it. We don't see them very often. I'm sure Mary sees them a lot more often than I do. But again, because it's a blue color, even though this gets fairly tall, I think I've seen these out there 2.5, these bloom spikes feet tall. But that purple color just doesn't draw my eye to where I immediately notice it. This is a really cool little plant. Again, it's blue, and I've got several in here that are wetland plants. This is a wetland obligate plant, blue mud plantain. It's actually in the pondweed family, so that makes sense. This was in a puddle in a sandy clay area. You can see the flowers down in here, but look at that sweet little flower. It's so pretty. And there's my finger. I had to hold the leaves aside so I could get a decent photo of the flower. So it's a tiny little flower relative to, you know, like my finger size, but I'm just always really excited to see these. And I'm always looking whenever we're out there and we're walking around looking at, and we find some puddles like old tire ruts or something in the dirt road. I'm always looking for the mud plantain. Real shiny leaves. And it's got, the leaves are on, this is one thing that distinguishes it. There's another species of Heteranthera in our area, but the fact that it has these spatulate leaves on these stalks is one of the main differentiating factors with the other species of Heteranthera. So another really interesting wetland plant, if your first reaction was to look at this and say, that looks like prairie bishopweed, well, that's exactly what I thought. We were walking down this trail. Here was this really pretty little wetland. There was a culvert, and the water went under this culvert, and this was on both sides of the trail. And I thought, what in the world is that? It looks like a giant prairie bishopweed. Well, it's in the same family. It's a cousin of bishop's weed. I have no idea why it's called dogshade. I never could find out why it got that name, but this was tall. This was, I'd say, at least 2 feet tall, way taller than bishop's weed. And it was down, it had its feet or its roots in the water. And so I got a little closer up to it so I could get a better picture of this umbel head. Very eye-catching, and it was just really, really fun to find it that day. This was I think this was in June last summer. So some of these, that's another thing that reminds me, some of these probably seem uncommon because they flower in the summer, and a lot of people aren't spending a lot of time outside hiking in the summer. So that may be another reason why they're just not as well known, some of these flowers. So now we're in cross timber sand, and this is Spoonflower. It's in the pea family. It's got the typical pea-shaped flower with a compound. It's got a 3-leaflet compound leaf. It's a vine, and this was growing up over some Indian grass, I believe that was, in sandy clay soil. It has a cousin, a beautiful cousin, who is very similar looking. Well, why am I blanking on it? Centrosema. Now I can't remember the common name of it, but the cousin, Centrosema americana, it has a round flower that looks almost just like this, but round. This one is oval or spoon shaped, which is where it gets its name as Spoonflower. Again, it's purple, so it's a little, for me at least, it's a little hard to spot. Really exciting when I find it though, because I love Spoonflower. I tried to get some of these growing in my yard, but I think my yard's a little bit too alkaline because this likes a lot of sand. Okay, this is a cool plant. This is another one from the sand. This is Texas Stalingya or woodland Stalingya, Stalingya sylvatica. And if you're a prairie lover, you're probably familiar with the Queen's Delight or the Prairie Stalingya, which is much smaller than this. This is a big, robust plant. This is probably 2.5 feet tall. It's in the Euphorbia family. So it doesn't have a very showy flower. This is the flower spike, and each one of these are the individual flowers. But it's very specific to cross timber sand. You can see it was in a beautiful field of little blue stem, and this is one of the units that the grassland staff burns relatively frequently. So there was a nice big colony of it, and right along a fence line, there's a barbed wire fence. So it's right by, there's a road right on the other side of this fence. So pretty easy to locate. This was in June. So it's a summer flowering plant. Anyway, just nice to find. A really really good find for and not very common. This is the cousin. This is in sand. It's in the same unit as the Stalingya. This is loose flowered Penstemon. It is a small, petite cousin to the big, wonderful foxglove Penstemon, false foxglove that we have. That's so common on the prairie alkaline sites. And this is a sand Penstemon. Penstemon's one also that's been reclassified. It's no longer in the Scrofulariaceae or the snapdragon family. Penstemon's now in the Plantain family, which I think that's really fascinating. This was in a patch growing with Barbara's buttons, which is a wonderful flower too, more common, which is why I didn't include it as a wildflower in this presentation. But I love Barbara's buttons, and it typically likes to grow in areas that are a little bit seepy, a little bit of wet spring action. This is called loose flowered because you can see that the flowers nod instead of being very straight like the large Penstemon is. Really fun to find this. And these flowers are small. They're probably only about maybe an inch long. So kind of hard to spot, but worth searching for sure. So now we're going to move to limestone gravel. This is on the tops of the hills of the grassland, the what are called barrens areas or glade areas. Real shallow soil, lots of gravelly limestone, very alkaline. This is shaggy evolvulus. And again, it's purple. So for me, at least, a little hard to spot. But the other thing about evolvulus is, look where the flowers actually come out. They're not at the tips. They're down here, what's called the axillary buds. So not only are they not at the tips and they're purple, they're kind of hidden by the foliage of the larger plant. So it's really hard to spot these sometimes. They're called shaggy because they're very hirsute or very furry. The leaves are covered with lots of hairs. That's a wonderful adaptation for being in a droughty, sunny place. The more hair you have on your leaves, the more insulation you have, and also the more surface area the leaf has to dissipate heat. This is in the morning glory family also. These are very tiny. Gosh, I'm thinking maybe the whole plant is like 3 inches tall, if it's lucky. And these flowers are really tiny, maybe a 1/4 to a 1/2 inch across at most. So a nice find. And this is an early spring bloomer. They're flowering now or will be flowering very soon also. This is a really uncommon wildflower. In fact, I think if I'm remembering correctly, it actually was considered for threatened listing or definitely on the watch list for the state, if not federally. Hallsdalia, it is in the pea family, like the other dahlias. It's got the typical pea butterfly flower, likes limestone gravel. Here's some growing amongst some little blue stem in a barrens area. If you could see the foliage, it would be mimosa-like with multiple leaflets. And the yellow is pretty eye-catching, but it's very small and it grows down amongst taller plants. So it's pretty hard. It's, again, even though it's yellow, it's kind of hard to spot. But look at this wonderful, how the flower buds look. They're candy cane striped with yellow and red. They're so pretty. And I think this is pretty much restricted to growing on these limestone barren sites. And one of the unfortunate things about being a limestone barren is that you're a very stable and oftentimes flat place to build things. And so a lot of habitat for a lot of these limestone plants is disappearing because that's a good place to build things, is on tops of hills where you've got this very stable limestone base, and it's pretty flat. And so a lot of habitat's been missing, or has gone missing now. So that's, I think, why this one has gotten more and more rare. I love whittlowwort. This one flowers in the late summer, early fall. This is actually in the carnation family. And this one's pretty obvious when it's flowering. It's very showy because it's got these wonderful yellow flowers. It has these spreading plants that put out a lot of flowers. It grows on the barrens, on the tops of hills. It's very specific, again, to that habitat. So when you find whittlowwort flowering, you know you're in a limestone barrens habitat. It's really an indicator for that kind of habitat. I've had people ask me about what the word wort means, and wort is an old term for some kind of a plant with medicinal properties. And whitlow is an old name for a fungal infection. So people would use whittlowwort. They would make a tincture or some kind of poultice out of the plant to treat fungal infections of the fingernails or the toenails. So I don't know that it actually has any medicinal actual properties, but people thought it did. So that's why they named it whittlowwort. So this is my last flower of the evening, and I wanted to end up with one of my favorites. This is also a barrens flower, the wonderful white rosin weed. And if anything's a prairie barrens indicator, it's white rosin weed. This is to me, the quintessential plant of prairie. It loves rocky, open spaces, very alkaline soil. It has huge root systems that can go down in the cracks through limestone, multiple feet. Sometimes I've read maybe 10 to 14 feet, their roots can go down. Unfortunately, that makes them extremely difficult, if not impossible, to transplant, to salvage if you're trying to save one from a construction site, because I've tried without success. You just can't seem to get quite enough root to move them. But this is typical habitat for it. Here's a nice Yucca pallida. This is narrow leaf coneflower, Echinacea and Gustafolia. Lots of nice gravelly prairie barrens soil. And the rosin weed is called rosin weed because it does make a rosin, or a sticky sap gets exuded from the leaves. The leaves are very deeply pinnate, very lobed, almost skeletonized, which is a good way to identify it when it's not flowering. And this is old dried leaves from a previous flowering. One of the really interesting things to me about the silphiums, here's a close-up of the flower, is that it's in the Asteraceae, the composite family. And the composite family was named that because each flower is a composite of multiple tiny flowers that are all working together to create this floral head. So these are not petals in the same way we think of other flowers having petals. These are ray flowers around the edge. And in the center these are disc flowers. And so sometimes the disc flowers are fertile and produce seeds, and the ray flowers are sterile. And sometimes it's the opposite. And so in the silphiums, the ray flowers are fertile. The disc flowers, even though they're flowering, they won't make a seed. You see, each one of these are individual little flowers, and they won't make a seed. You'll find the fertile seeds around the edge of the dried silphium head. So if you're trying to grow any from seed, that's where you need to look for the fertile seeds, is around the edge and not in the center. So that's a little stroll through the grasslands and some of the wildflower wanderings. And so if there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
How accessible is the grasslands to people visiting? I mean, I know you covered that at the beginning, but I just wanted to ask you again, like, and is it open to anyone who wants to go there?
It's open to anyone who wants to go there. But like I said, it is managed for multiple uses. And so there is hunting. That's one thing I forgot to mention at the beginning. There is hunting, and it's open to all forms of hunting that the state legally allows. So there's deer hunting, quail hunting, turkey hunting, dove hunting, and there's bow seasons and rifle. And so it's probably best to check with the staff, or I'm not sure if they keep up their website faithfully, but probably best to check with the staff. And also on your own, check and see what are the current hunting seasons that are going on, if any, so that you know. And when we go out there, especially in the fall and winter, we always wear something orange. I don't have the blaze orange official, but I have an orange pullover, and Mary and Jean always wear orange, like blaze orange. But it's not marked like a park. I mean, it is definitely open to the public, but it's not intended to be that user-friendly. There's not a sign that says, here you are at Unit 71. You have to use the map, and they have a very subtle marking system. Their fence gates are painted with this kind of a sea green aqua color. And sometimes that's the only way you can tell that you're actually on grasslands property, is by, they've gotten a little better. Some of the units have wooden markers that are carved with the unit number, but it's really, I think the map costs $10, and it's worth, I mean, I have used that map so much. I've been going out there now almost 5 years regularly, and I still have to use the map to find places where I want to go.
Are there any like actual trails?
Yes, there are actual trails. They're actually mostly horse trails, but they're multi-use. People can hike on them also. There's also a lot of old roads that are used as trails.
Where can we get the map? Do we have to go there to get the map, or can you get it ahead of time?
You can buy the map online at the Forest Service site. Just go to USDA, and I can't remember the exact, but it's not very hard to find. You can go to USDA's website and search for Lbj Grasslands, and then it's pretty easy. They have an office in Decatur on 287, just west after you pass the main downtown area. The Grasslands office is on the right-hand side. Unfortunately, right now, the office is not open, and I'm not sure if the office, when it will reopen, but you can get that map. But you can buy it online, and I guess they'll mail it to you. It's a big map. It's like an old road map, you know, it's that size.
Is the office closed because of COVID or for another
Yes.
reason? Okay.
Yes. Okay, well, let me stop sharing so y'all can do your meeting.
Thank you, Suzanne, for this presentation. That was very, very interesting.
Appreciate that.